Hello, today we will start number lecture 3 on the subject comparative typology of English, Kazakh and the Russian language. And the theme of our lecture, the history of typological investigation. And the plan of our lecture, the history of typology as a branch of linguistics, the history of typological investigation. And the history of typology as a branch of linguistics. The history of linguistics study goes deep into the history of mankind. Each new period of development of science about language has its own specific features. They appeal new branch aspect and the methods of language study and new linguistic schools and directions areas. One of these directions in linguistics is typology. Attempts to establish groups of kindred language were made from the 16th century but on consistently scientific proof and study of the actual relationship between languages became possible when historical comparative methods of language study was created and it was in the first quarter of the 16th century. These methods developed in connection with comparative observation of language belong to Indo-European family, and its appearance was stimulated by the discovery of Sanskrit. So, William Jones, or an Orientalist who was the first to point out the form of virologically grounded scientific hypothesis that Sanskrit, Greek, Gothic, and some other languages of India and Europe has sprung from the same source which no longer existed. He based his point on the observation of verbal forms or rules and certain grammatical forms in comparative languages. The history of language typology may go earlier than 1800s. It's assumed that the great contribution from two German linguists, Friedrich von Schlegel and William von Humboldt and other works brought a name of typological research. However, unlike contemporary typologists, the two German linguists were also very much interested in working on various languages almost exclusively in morphology. By looking at the word formation process that we employed in languages that they studied, they proposed to categorize languages on the basis of how much morphology was used in the construction of words and how its morphology was used. Here is the connection. The connection between Indian and European language were studied scientifically at the beginning of 20th century. Here is Franz Bopp, Rasmus Christian Vask, Jacob Lidwig, Karl and Alexander Christophorovich Vostokov. Typological investigation of languages begin in 19th century when Europeans got to know Sanskrit, the language of ancient India. German scientist Friedrich von Schlegel, who took great interest in the culture and the language of ancient India, was the first to pay attention to differences in structure of languages and distinguished two groups: affixational language, inflectional language. To the first group, they referred Turkish languages, Polynesian language, and also Chinese. To the second group, he preferred Semantic, Georgian, and French language. His brother August Schlegel made a radical change in that classification and distinction three groups of language: affixational language, Kurundi, Niger, Congo, Burundi. Inflecting language like Greek, it would also accept affixational, but the affix that are employed and here is the employed typical contain a great deal of semantic information. For example, the suffix on reveals that the subject is third person. That is, the subject is plural, that the verb is past tense and has derivative aspect, that a sentence is statement rather than command or condition. its future developed in the works of such scientists as representatives of the 19th and 20th century. Here is Fyodor Ivanovich Baslayev, Philip Fedorovich Fortunatov, and Leonard Bloomfield. In the early 19th century, 20th century, several important changes took place with the advent of Ferdinand de Saussure. He and his contemporary linguists begin to argue that also language may be organic and therefore changing. At any given point in time, language is a self-contained system. Based on the historical comparative methods, we can compare the native world of the Indo-European language that evidence the kinship. Thus, Leonard Bloomfield wrote, in order to describe the language, one needs to historical knowledge. Whatever this brought a shift from a diachronic perspective to a synchronic perspective, looking at the language as a single stage in its development. Leonard Bloomfield and other linguists from American structuralism continued to use and emphasize morphology in their research and language. They completely reject any belief that difference in morphological form revealed difference in each inner form of language and the intellect of the people who spoke it. The history of typological investigation. Later work by the Prague School, particularly by Skalika, recognized that many language properties are associated in probabilistic rather than absolute fashion. In describing them, one can only propose a non-absolutely universal and should have space for the other who will further take up the issue and continue the research. So the American structuralists and the linguists from Prague School helped the discipline of typology to flourish in several ways. But it was Joseph Harold Greenberg who made a landmark change in outlook of the field of typology and the nature of typological research work. His contribution in the field cannot be described in some number of points. However, some very important ones can be started for pedagogical purpose as follows. Joseph Harold Greenberg pioneered the establishment of a quantitative and qualitative base for a typological study. Until the time Joseph Greenberg came into the scheme, typology was highly subjective and rejected the scientific standards that American linguists were trying so desperately to achieve in the 1940s and 1950s. He developed a strategy to measure numerically both the degree and the kind of morphological presence in a language. His qualitative approach showed that a language did not fall into discrete morphological types. In other words, a language such as English cannot be said to be an inflecting or a no-structured language in an absolutely way. Rather, it's closer to being a non-structured language than Greenlandic, Eskimo, but more inflecting than Khmer. The real task of the typological work is not to answer what kind of language are there, but to answer what kind of structures the language have. This assumption has become explicit in the work of many current typologists and also in several series of grammar. Joseph Greenberg made full use of the ideas and the notion proposed by the Prague School that certain aspects of structure in language correlate and the implication universals can be stated in terms of the correlation. These implication universals have the form given X in a language, Y is also found. His seminal paper, Some Universals of Grammar, with particular reference to the other of meaningful elements. Here is the next, in conclusion, William von Humboldt's perspective that language structure reflect intellectual capacity lead to a claim or cultural superiority, where language were judged based on their resemblance to an idealized linguist system. This approach, however, was later discredited as linguists recognized that all languages, regardless of structure, equally complex and capable of expressing sophisticated thought. The rejection of this early assumption marked a significance that in linguistic research, particularly in late 19th century, as scholars moved towards more scientific and enabled study to language. This change not only reshaped linguistic typology but also reinforced the understanding that no language is inherently superior to other, emphasizing the rich diversity and the adaptability of human communication. Thank you for your attention. See you soon.